Welcome back to Movie Recap. Today I'll share with you a dark comedy horror film from 1960, Little Shop of Horrors. A sergeant, Joe Flink, makes a radio announcement. He's on a 24-hour homicide shift. The area under his supervision is the part of town that everyone knows about, but no one wants to see because the crime rate is consistently higher than anywhere else. It's called Skid Row. In Skid Row, Mr. Mushnick owns a flower shop. He attends to a customer, Mrs. Shiva. Always visiting with a traumatic incident to tell, Mrs. Shiva is there to buy some carnations for her nephew's funeral. She asks for a discount, which Mr. Mushnick clearly declines as he's struggling to keep the shop running. Another customer walks in wearing a yellow vest, so Mr. Mushnick calls him Mr. Yellow Vest. Audrey and Seymour work for Mr. Mushnick. Seymour sings in the background as Mr. Mushnick attends a phone call. It's the dentist, Dr. Farb. He places an order for 2 gladiolus and 1 fern to decorate his waiting room. Being a dentist at Skid Row, he can only afford such flower arrangements. Mr. Mushnick calls Seymour and tells him to take 2 gladiolus, cut them equally, and arrange them with a fern and deliver them to Dr. Farb. Audrey attends Mrs. Shiva, while Mr. Mushnick caters Mr. Yellow Vest. He asks for some carnations. When Mr. Mushnick brings some flowers to show him, he asks not to arrange them into a bouquet as he just wants to eat them. He takes out a salt shaker from his pocket and begins to eat the flowers. Meanwhile, Seymour, trying to cut the gladiolus stems equally, cuts the whole stem and comes confused to Mr. Mushnick asking him what to do. Mr. Mushnick is annoyed as he's already messed up on several occasions, so he fires Seymour. Seymour offers to bring in an unusual plant to the shop to save his job. Mr. Mushnick declines his offer, but Mr. Yellow Vest suggests that this could actually increase the sales. He says that he has eaten at many flower shops, and the most popular shops tend to have unique plants that people always come to see. So Mr. Mushnick gives Seymour his last chance to keep the job and tells him to bring back the fancy plant. If Mr. Yellow Vest approves the plant, he can keep the job. So Seymour quickly leaves to get the plant. Seymour goes to his house to get the plant. His mother hears him as he stumbles on the mop bucket. She asks him to come and see her tongue. He goes in and sees her tongue. His mother is a hypochondriac. She is superstitious about her health and keeps assuming she is seriously ill. She asks Seymour if he picked up her test results. He says that the doctor says there's nothing wrong with her, but she isn't convinced. Seymour gives her a bottle of alcohol with some advice about health, and she gets satisfied she is gaining health as she drinks. Seymour grabs the weird plant from the kitchen counter and leaves. It's a type of Venus flytrap which his mother dislikes. Seymour brings it back to the shop. Mr. Mushnick is not impressed. Audrey thinks it is one of a kind and asks where Seymour found it. He says he bought the seeds from a Japanese farmer. When Mr. Mushnick asks its name, he says he calls it Audrey Jr. Audrey gets excited, but Mr. Mushnick wants to throw the plant away. Mr. Yellow Vest tells Mr. Mushnick to allow Seymour to bring the plant back to health, and people from all over the world will come to see it. Mr. Mushnick gives a week's time to Seymour. When he leaves, Seymour tells Audrey that he has tried feeding the plant everything, but it keeps getting weaker by the day. Audrey encourages Seymour and tells him that she believes in him. When she leaves, Seymour sits by the plant and starts talking to it. He tells the plant that he did everything for it and it was the only plant that he ever planted. At sunset, the plant opens just like every day. Seymour gets up to water it when he accidentally pricks his hand. When his blood falls into the plant, it starts munching on it. Seymour is surprised, and realizing the plant has an appetite for blood, he pricks his finger and sprinkles it on the plant. The next morning, Mr. Mushnick gladly welcomes Seymour to his shop and announces a $2 pay raise for Seymour, as the Audrey Jr. has now grown over an inch tall. Mr. Mushnick notices the bandages on Seymour's fingers and asks what happened. Seymour says he was stung by 10 bees at a time. 2 girls read the sign outside and come to see the plant. They are heads of a florist committee at a school and looking to spend $2,000 on flowers. Mr. Mushnick gets excited as they say they will be getting in touch about the deal. Mrs. Shiva walks in to buy flowers for another funeral in her family. Mr. Mushnick gives a free carnation to her. However, the plant seems to be dying of thirst. Mr. Mushnick, who is dreaming of moving his shop to Beverly Hills, quickly tells Seymour to do something about the plant or quit otherwise. Seymour says that he was allowed a week and he'll do anything to revive the plant. The following night, the plant says, "Feed me." Seymour gets excited that he's got a talking plant. He feeds a little blood to it, but the plant says, "Feed me more." Seymour helplessly says he's anemic, so he can't afford to give Junior more blood, but the plant keeps demanding more. So Seymour leaves to go for a walk and think of a way. He stands at a railway station and picks up a big rock to aim at a liquor bottle. As he throws the stone, a drunkard appears from behind the bottle trying to get it. The rock hits the man and he falls onto the railway tracks and gets run down by the train. Seymour gets scared and picks up his crushed body in a jute sack. He tries to dump it at various places but fails out of the fear of being spotted. So he takes it back to the Mushnick's flower shop. Audrey Jr. says, "Feed me," and Seymour tells it to stop bothering him as he is worried he committed a murder, and in the bag he carries there's... Before he can complete his sentence, Audrey Jr. says, "Food?" Seymour cringes at the thought at first, but then feeds it with parts of the corpse. Meanwhile, Mr. Mushnick and Audrey are having dinner at a restaurant when Mr. Mushnick tells Audrey he left his money in his other jacket. She asks, out loud, if he doesn't have money to pay the bill. The waitress hears it and tells Mr. Mushnick to go and bring money. When Mr. Mushnick comes to the shop, he sees Seymour feeding Audrey Jr. human body parts. He gets frightened and rushes back to the restaurant and orders loads of alcoholic drinks. When the waitress asks for money, he gives her his watch. Audrey asks the reason for his distress, and he says that he'll tell her after reporting it to the police. But the next morning, he sees a crowd of people gathered around his shop to see Audrey Jr., so he dismisses his plan to report to the police. When he enters the shop, Audrey excitedly tells him that they made $85 already and she had barely opened the shop. The two girls seal the deal to buy flowers worth $2,000. Seymour comes in with a toothache and Mr. Mushnick grabs him, bringing him to the storeroom of the shop. He confronts Seymour, wondering what's the deal with the plant, and asks what it really is. Seymour tells him that it is a cross between a Butterworth and a Venus flytrap. It has grown twice its size yesterday as it feeds on flies, and it wouldn't grow more so it doesn't need more flies. Mr. Mushnick sends him off to the dentist and decides not to tell anyone as he's making money. At the dentist's office, Seymour hears a patient being tortured by Dr. Farb because he didn't pay his bills. The patient runs out of the clinic and Seymour tries to escape, but Dr. Farb gets him. As Seymour is sitting on the seat, the dentist asks if he was the guy who ruined his gladiolus. Then he starts poking Seymour's mouth with the drill. He pulls out a tooth that wasn't hurting and tries to reach Seymour with the forceps to dig out another. Seymour pulls the fountain to defend himself and Dr. Farb gets excited and says, "Ah, a duo." They both have a fight and Seymour accidentally pushes Dr. Farb, who hits his head on the door and passes out. A crazy patient comes who is fond of getting hurt. He is somehow related to Mrs. Shiva. Seymour pretends to be Dr. Farb and tries to send him to come another day, but he insists he wants to be seen. Seymour gets rid of Dr. Farb and brings the patient in. He pulls out most of his teeth and fills them with silver. The weird patient leaves very happy, saying he'd recommend Dr. Farb to his friends. Then, Seymour brings Dr. Farb's body to feed Audrey Jr. He feels ashamed of himself for committing 2 murders in 2 days. Detectives Frank and Joe take on the case of the 2 murders where the bodies are missing. Frank lost one of his kids who was playing with matches. Both of the detectives go to Skid Row for investigation, where the Audrey Jr. has grown enormously. Audrey comes in and kisses Seymour for growing Audrey Jr. so big. He asks her out on a date, and she happily agrees. Mr. Mushnick is confused and scared of the size of the plant. Mrs. Shiva comes in to buy flowers for his nephew's son who died playing with matches. The 2 girls walk in to buy roses for their boat parade. Audrey attends to the girls, and Seymour serves Mrs. Shiva. Mr. Yellowvest admires the plant and proudly says it was his idea to let Seymour bring the plant in. The detectives come in and show Mr. Mushnick the pictures of the missing drunkard and Dr. Farb. They tell Mr. Mushnick that they found blood in Dr. Farb's office, but his body is missing. Mr. Mushnick, confused and nervous, recognizes Dr. Farb in the picture and tells them that he is Mr. Mushnick's dentist. The detectives notice his nervousness but aren't suspicious of him. They tell him to report to them immediately if he sees any of them, and Mr. Mushnick agrees. He then takes Seymour to the storeroom and asks him if the plant is done growing up. Seymour says it is, as he has eaten a lot. Mr. Mushnick says, "Eaten who?" and then changes the question to what. Seymour says it ate 1,000,000 beetles. Mr. Mushnick tells him that he'll be watching the plant tonight when Seymour goes out on a date with Audrey. Audrey comes to inform Mr. Mushnick that there's an important committee outside to see Mr. Mushnick. Seymour tells Audrey that he hasn't got any money, so they decide on going to Seymour's house for dinner. The elegant lady visiting the shop tells Mr. Mushnick that she's a representative of the Silent Flowers Observers from South California. She asks who created the magnificent bloom. Seymour walks in and says it was him. She introduces herself as Mrs. Hortense. She asks Seymour how can Audrey Jr. be propagated, but Seymour says it is a cross and that can't be done. Mr. Hortense asks Seymour if the little buds around the plant will bloom. Seymour says they will open up at sunset the next day. Mrs. Hortense informs Seymour he will be given the annual trophy for growing the most magnificent plant and that she will be there to present it to him the next day at sunset when the little buds open. The following night, Seymour takes Audrey to his house where his mother welcomes them. She brings them a cough syrup for starters, and Audrey raises a toast to Audrey Jr., but Seymour says it should be for Audrey Sr. Then his mother serves them cod liver oil soup and chow mein made of Chinese herbs. At the shop, Mr. Mushnick is keeping an eye on the plant when he falls asleep. Soon, he is woken up by Audrey Jr. saying, "Feed me." At first, he doesn't believe he heard the plant talk, but then he realizes that it really is talking. Mr. Mushnick asks what he needs to eat, to which the plant replies, it could eat him as he looks fat enough. Mr. Mushnick takes it as dark humor and tells Audrey Jr. that he will never feed it any more people and let him starve to death. A thief tries to break in. Mr. Mushnick hides in the glass cupboard. When the thief sees him, Mr. Mushnick steps out of the cupboard and surrenders his money in the cash register. The thief finds $30 and asks for more money as he saw a lot of customers at the shop that afternoon. To get rid of the thief, Mr. Mushnick tells him that the rest of the money is in the big plant. He tells the thief to knock the plant to let it open and look at the bottom of it. When the thief tries to look for the money, Audrey Jr. swallows him alive and spits out his gun. Seymour and Audrey plan a picnic at night. Seymour's mother disapproves of Seymour marrying Audrey as she thinks he should marry a sick woman. The one who is healthy will dump him eventually. When Seymour tells her that he only wants Audrey, she blackmails him emotionally that she'll be left alone and miserable. That day, Mr. Mushnick says he will not guard the plant anymore. Once the trophy thing is done, they will get rid of the plant forever. So, Seymour and Audrey stay with the plant that night. Seymour finds a peanut butter and jelly sandwich very delicious as he has never eaten something that's not a medication. He tells Audrey that he wants to go to the South and become a botanist. Audrey wants to go with him. Both of them confess their love for each other, and as they're going to kiss, Audrey says, "Feed me." Audrey asks, "What does Seymour mean?" Seymour says he's kidding. And as she's looking at him, the plant says, "I'm hungry." Audrey is surprised that Seymour didn't move his mouth and then asks, how did he say it? Seymour says that he's a ventriloquist, and pretends he is saying all of this. Audrey leaves, saying that he's acting like an idiot. Seymour follows her outside and tells her that he has so many things to take care of, but soon he will marry her when he gets famous for getting the trophy, and then they can go to the South as they planned. Audrey says that all these things have nothing to do with what happened. She tells him that he should come to her when he gets his senses back. When Seymour comes back into the shop, he tells Audrey Jr. that he's tired of taking care of it. He took care of him when he was sick and fed him with his own blood and people when it was dying. No one would do such a thing for a plant. When he's about to leave, the plant calls it by his last name, Krelborn, and hypnotizes him. Junior then commands Seymour to go find him food. Seymour walks into town under hypnosis. A sex worker tries to catch him as his customer. Seymour keeps on saying, "Master needs food," and keeps ignoring her. Finally, she uses a banana peel on which Seymour trips. She gets a chance to talk to him. Seymour tells her that she's too skinny for his master. Finally, they cut to the chase, and in order to decide whose place they're going to go to, they decide to flip a coin. Seymour doesn't have a coin, so he picks up a big rock to flip, wet or dry. He spits on one side and throws it in the air. The rock hits the girl in her head. She falls unconscious, and Seymour brings her back to Audrey Jr. The next morning, everyone arrives at the shop to attend the ceremony of the trophy presentation to Seymour. Seymour tells Audrey he will explain everything to her after this is all over. Mrs. Hortense tells Seymour that if the buds don't open at sunset, they'll have to do it some other day. The detectives also come to the ceremony. They want to witness if anything is suspicious. As soon as the sunset begins, Audrey Jr. opens up, and soon the little buds around it begin to sprout. There are faces of the people Audrey Jr. ate in the flowers. The detectives ask Seymour about it, but he runs away saying, "I didn't mean it." The two detectives and Mr. Mushnick follow him. He runs all around the town, followed by the detectives and Mr. Mushnick. Since Seymour always stumbles on things and falls, Mr. Mushnick tries to trip him on his leg, but to his surprise, Seymour dodges it. Finally, Seymour manages to come to the shop where the plant is still demanding food. Seymour gets angry and says that Audrey Jr. has destroyed his life. He grabs a pair of garden scissors and climbs into the plant to teach him a lesson. The detectives, Seymour's mother, Audrey, and Mr. Mushnick all come to the shop. One of the buds sprouts, and there's Seymour's face in it. Seymour says, "I didn't mean it."